Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really critical question that's playing out right now in Latin America.
Hmm.
Can Colombia, look to El Salvador's very firm prison strategy as a way to tackle its own serious problems?
Hmm.
We're talking overcrowded prisons, high crime levels.
Yeah, it's a huge issue.
We've gathered a range of sources for you on this. Crime data, human rights assessments from both countries, policy analysis too. So let's just get straight into understanding what's really at stake here.
Right. And I think what immediately stands out when you examine the situation is the fundamental difference in approach between these two nations. Even though they're both grappling with, major crime challenges, you've got Colombia struggling with a prison system that's just bursting at the seams.
Yeah.
And then you see El Salvador under President Bukele adopting what, well, many observers would call a pretty radical and highly assertive strategy.
Absolutely. Let's maybe start by painting a clearer picture of just how critical the situation is in Colombia's prisons. The 2024 figures from INPEC, that's their National Penitentiary and Prison Institute, they show a nationwide overcapacity of, get this, 150%.
Wow, 150%.
Yeah. And to really grasp that, think about La Picota Prison in Bogota. It's currently holding over 10,000 people,
Okay.
but it was only built to house 4,500.
Mm.
The sheer density, it's hard to even imagine.
And with that level of extreme overcrowding, I mean, the consequences are pretty predictable and, frankly, deeply concerning.
Like what?
Well, we're talking about an environment where violence can just easily erupt, where basic living conditions fall, way below acceptable standards,
Right.
and where the public's frustration with crime on the outside only gets more intense because the perception is the justice system just isn't working effectively.
Exactly. And it's this intense pressure, isn't it, that has led President Petro's administration to seriously consider whether this Bukele model from El Salvador could offer some kind of way forward.
Yeah.
For listeners who might not be familiar, this model is really centered on a very aggressive crackdown on gangs.
Mm-hmm.
And its most visible element is probably the CE-COT mega prison, this huge facility
Yeah.
designed to hold up to 40,000 inmates.
40,000. It's massive. But, the model involves more than just a big prison.
Right.
It also includes implementing really strict penalties for any gang-related activities and, crucially, this ongoing suspension of key legal rights.
Ah, the state of emergency.
Exactly. It's been in effect since March 2022, and this isn't just symbolic. It has really significant implications for how the justice system actually operates on the ground.
And I suppose the reported outcomes in El Salvador would have really caught Colombia's eye.
You'd have to think so.
Yeah, a 2023 Catalyst report indicated this dramatic reduction in homicides. It went from like a really high 103 per 100,000 people back in 2015.
Which is astronomical.
Right. Down to just 8 per 100,000 in 2022. I mean, those are the kind of statistics that any government struggling with violence would find pretty hard to ignore.
They are indeed striking figures. However, it's important for listeners to understand that some analysts have pointed to other factors, too.
Okay.
Factors beyond just the prison strategy that might have contributed to this drop. Things like possible gang truces before the main crackdown really started.
Ah, so it's maybe not just one single cause.
Exactly. That complexity is really a key takeaway to consider when you're evaluating how directly applicable this model might be to Colombia's, unique context.
That's a crucial point about looking beyond the surface numbers.
Yeah.
And it leads us right to the very serious human rights concerns that have been raised about the Bukele model.
Mm-hmm. Huge concerns.
Organizations like Human Rights Watch have documented over 350 deaths of people in custody in El Salvador just since 2022.
Over 350.
Yeah. And furthermore, a 2025 Amnesty report highlights this, well, deeply troubling fact that children as young as 12 have been detained in adult prison facilities.
12 years old in adult prisons.
It's truly shocking, and it raises these profound ethical questions about the lengths this model goes to.
It really does present a stark picture, doesn't it, of the potential trade-offs involved when you focus almost exclusively on a punitive approach to crime.
Right.
And bringing this back to Colombia's specific situation, I mean, their motivation for even considering this model is clear.
Because they're desperate.
Well, they are facing this deeply entrenched crisis of prison overcrowding and a persistent, serious problem with crime. The fact that in 2024, nearly half 48% of their entire inmate population was in pretrial detention.
Wow, nearly half haven't even been convicted yet.
Exactly. It just underscores the massive strain on their judicial system. Plus, you mentioned the riots, 15 prison riots last year alone. That's a stark indicator of the instability within the system.
Right. That high percentage of pretrial detention really points to a judicial system just struggling to process cases efficiently, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Leading to people spending potentially long periods in these overcrowded prisons before any conviction.
Exactly. And it was against this backdrop that we saw some initial moves, right? Like Defense Minister Diego Molano publicly expressing admiration for El Salvador's approach back in March 2025.
Mhm.
He even suggested the need for a mega jail right there in Bogota.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, that kind of statement provoked a pretty strong reaction.
I bet.
It certainly did. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, immediately voiced serious concerns. They warned about the very real risk of replicating the kind of human rights abuses seen in El Salvador if Colombia were to adopt similar measures.
So since then, it looks like Colombian officials have been trying to learn more. Meetings with Salvadoran counterparts, people like Bukele's Minister of Public Safety.
Yes, that's been reported. But it's also noteworthy that they have apparently engaged with human rights organizations, too,
Okay.
which suggests at least some awareness of the very sensitive ethical issues at play here.
Which brings us, I guess, to the core question we're exploring in this deep dive.
Yeah.
Is it actually possible for Colombia to find a way to achieve those potential crime reduction benefits that El Salvador's strategy seems to offer, at least on the surface, while still upholding fundamental human rights principles?
It's a truly immense and incredibly complex challenge. There's no easy answer there.
Okay, let's really get into the specifics then. Just how severe is this prison crisis in Colombia? We mentioned 150% overcapacity, but what does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, the 2024 numbers showed 97,000 inmates housed in facilities that were only ever designed for 65,000 people nationwide.
97,000 crammed into space for 65,000.
Exactly. And these aren't just abstract numbers. They translate into, frankly, dreadful living conditions for the people incarcerated.
Like La Modelo.
Yeah, consider La Modelo prison in Bogota. Reports indicate situations where you have up to 20 individuals crammed into a single cell.
20 people.
20 people. Think about the lack of basic sanitation, the absence of any personal space, just the overall degradation of human dignity that conditions like that inevitably breed.
It sounds horrific.
Mm-hmm.
And that El Tiempo investigation from 2024, it documented 12 inmate deaths in La Modelo in that single year just from untreated infections.
Right. That really brings home the dire state of healthcare within these facilities. This isn't just about discomfort. It's about a systemic failure to provide even basic medical attention, often with fatal consequences.
And beyond the immediate humanitarian concerns, this level of severe overcrowding must lead to a really dangerous security situation inside the prisons, too.
Oh, inevitably. The 27 reported prison riots in 2024, which resulted in numerous injuries, and tragically, some deaths are a clear indication of the extreme tension and, frankly, desperation within those walls.
And in that kind of environment, gangs can really take hold, right?
Absolutely. They can, and they do exert significant influence. Groups like the Clan del Golfo have established a strong presence within many Colombian prisons.
Using them as bases.
Essentially, yeah. Using them as operational basis for activities like drug trafficking, extortion, activities that reach far beyond the prison walls themselves.
Wow. There was that 2023 study, University of the Andes, I think. It found that a staggering 60% of inmates had actually witnessed gang violence inside prison.
60%.
Yeah.
It's a shocking statistic. And the fact that prison guards are often either, complicit in these activities or simply overwhelmed by the sheer numbers.
Powerless.
Yeah. It speaks volumes about the lack of effective control within the system.
Fernando Tamayo from the University of the Andes, he talked about this, didn't he? The difficulty of managing prisons at such extreme overcapacity.
He did. He rightly pointed out the immense difficulty. Maintaining even basic security and oversight requires adequate staffing, which is something the Colombian prison system clearly lacks right now.
So what are the underlying factors then? How does it get this bad? It sounds like a mix of things.
It is. It's definitely multifaceted. One major contributing factor is just the sheer volume of cases overwhelming the Colombian judicial system.
Right, the backlog.
Yeah, that backlog of 1.2 million cases as of 2024. And remember that 48% pretrial detention figure? It highlights a system struggling to cope. It means a large number of individuals are spending significant time locked up without even being convicted.
And then there's the whole war on drugs aspect.
Absolutely. That's had a significant impact on incarceration rates globally, and Colombia's no exception. INPEC data suggests around 30% of the current inmate population is in prison for drug-related offenses.
Which makes you wonder, could alternative sentencing or different approaches be more effective for some of those people?
That's a key policy question, definitely. And we also need to acknowledge the role of systemic corruption within the prison system itself.
Aye.
That 2024 Semana expose, it detailed allegations of guards at La Pacoda accepting substantial bribes, reportedly up to $5,000.
To do what? Smuggle things in?
Exactly. To smuggle contraband like weapons, drugs. It demonstrates a deep level of corruption that just completely undermines any efforts at reform or control.
Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, public frustration with crime is just. You can feel it, can't you?
It's palpable, yes. Over 12,000 homicides in 2024. Persistently high crime rates in major cities like Cali and Medellin.
And extortion is up too.
A significant 15% increase in extortion reported by the national police. All of this contributes to this climate of fear and insecurity among the general population.
Understandably, this leads people to look pretty closely at how the government's responding or not responding.
Right. That 2024 Invammer survey showed 70% of Colombians feel unsafe. And 65% believe the government has basically failed to address prison overcrowding. That indicates a really high level of public dissatisfaction.
And we can't lose sight of the human cost in all this.
Yeah.
Beyond the statistics, we're talking about individuals living under the constant threat of violence, disease.
Those 300 cases of tuberculosis reported in prisons by the Colombian Ombudsman's Office in 2024. That's a direct consequence of these overcrowded, unsanitary conditions.
And you've got lack of rehabilitation, neglect of basic needs. It must be dangerous for the guards, too.
Absolutely. 15 guards reported injured in riots last year. Low morale. It's a system that appears to be failing pretty much everyone involved.
President Petro did acknowledge this, didn't he? Early 2025, he said something like, "Our prisons reflect society's failures."
He did. He said, "We must act, but we must act with justice," which signals an awareness at the highest level.
Okay.
However, the crucial question remains whether looking to El Salvador's model is actually a step towards that justice, or maybe a move in a fundamentally different and perhaps more worrying direction.
Okay, let's shift focus now and really dissect this Bukele model in El Salvador that Colombia is considering. We know it's described as tough, but what are the core elements? How's it been implemented?
Well, fundamentally, the Bukele model is based on a strategy of mass incarceration, strict segregation of suspected gang members, and implementing what many would consider exceptionally firm, some might say extreme measures aimed at completely dismantling gang activity.
And the big symbol of this is that CECOT mega prison, opened in 2023, capacity for 40,000 inmates. It's one of the biggest in Latin America, right?
It is. It's a very concrete, very visible representation of this tough-on-crime strategy.
But you said it's more than just the building.
Oh, definitely. The physical infrastructure is only part of the picture. Absolutely crucial to how this model works is the state of emergency.
The one declared back in March 2022.
Exactly. And it's been continuously in effect well over 1,000 days as of late 2024. And it resulted in the suspension of several fundamental constitutional rights.
Rights like legal counsel, limits on pretrial detention, things like that.
Precisely those things. These are significant limitations on individual liberties, make no mistake.
And the number of arrests under this. It's huge, isn't it?
Truly staggering. By 2025, over 81,000 individuals had been detained.
81,000.
To put that in perspective, that's almost 2% of El Salvador's entire population. And as Human Rights Watch highlighted in a 2023 report, a significant chunk of these arrests, maybe around 39,000, were based on very broadly defined charges. Things like unlawful association.
Unlawful association. That sounds vague.
It raises concerns, certainly, that the criteria for arrest might be quite wide-ranging, casting a very broad net, as you said earlier.
And this approach is also extended down to children, hasn't it? Which is just hard to fathom.
Tragically, yes. The Bukele administration lowered the age of criminal responsibility for gang-related crimes down to just 12 years old.
12.
According to Human Rights Watch data from 2024, this has led to the detention of over 3,300 children.
3,300 kids.
And numerous reports suggest that many of these minors actually have no documented links to gang activity at all.
And the conditions inside CCOT, the mega prison, reports suggest they're deliberately harsh.
Extremely so, by all accounts. Inmates are reportedly confined to their windowless cells for about 23.5 hours each day.
Virtually no time outside the cell.
Minimal time for any form of exercise or recreation. Reports from news outlets like NPR, CNN, they've detailed a severe lack of basic necessities, shortages of mattresses, inadequate sanitation, even open toilets in communal areas.
So the conditions themselves are part of the punishment.
It certainly appears that way. The conditions seem designed to be punitive through significant deprivation.
President Bukele himself has been very vocal defending this, right? Using social media, highlighting the high incarceration rate.
Oh, yes. His public messaging is consistent and assertive. These tough measures are necessary, and they are responsible for the drop in crime.
And the claimed success, well, it's hard to ignore those homicide numbers we talked about.
It is. The Salvadoran government and its supporters frequently point to the country becoming the quote-unquote safest in Latin America. They cite that dramatic drop in the homicide rate.
And Bukele seems popular. He won re-election.
Very high public approval ratings, consistently, culminating in his re-election in February 2024. It suggests a significant portion of the population supports his methods, or at least the perceived results.
But, as we touched on earlier, these apparent successes seem to have come with really serious human rights implications.
Indeed. The human rights cost, according to numerous international and domestic human rights groups, has been devastating. We're talking about widespread and credible allegations of torture, beatings, and that truly alarming number of deaths in state custody, over 350 since March 2022.
And those reports about children. Your child does not exist here?
Yes. Reports like that contain horrific testimonies detailing the abuse of children in detention, the denial of fundamental rights, access to lawyers, communication with families, along with the use of mass virtual hearings that critics say severely undermine due process. These are all deeply troubling aspects of this model.
And it sounds like getting independent eyes on what's actually happening inside is difficult.
Extremely difficult. The Bukele government has largely blocked access for independent human rights monitors. They've only permitted carefully controlled visits by select media outlets.
Controlled visits.
Yeah. There have even been reports of government officials openly boasting about holding inmates in solitary confinement in complete darkness as a deterrent. This lack of transparency makes getting a comprehensive, unbiased assessment really hard.
Looking beyond the prisons, then, what have been the broader effects on Salvadoran society as a whole?
Well, critics argue that while gang violence may have decreased, it's been at least partially replaced by violence perpetrated by the state itself.
State violence replacing gang violence.
There are increasingly concerning reports of police and military personnel engaging in the same kinds of exploitative practices like extortion that the gangs were notorious for.
Wow.
The prolonged state of emergency has also fostered this climate of fear and self-censorship. Bukele has been openly critical of the judiciary,
Attacking judges.
making statements like, "We'll be watching judges who favor criminals," which has naturally raised concerns about the erosion of judicial independence.
Well, it's harder for people to seek justice if they are abused by gangs or the state.
Exactly. It limits recourse. And as Amnesty International and others have pointed out, it's often marginalized communities that bear a disproportionate burden under these sweeping emergency measures.
All of this paints a deeply concerning picture. And it raises very serious questions for Colombia as it considers maybe adopting similar policies.
Absolutely.
El Salvador's experience really does sound like a potential cautionary tale from a human rights perspective.
It is indeed. Human rights organizations have gone as far as accusing the Bukele administration's policies of potentially constituting crimes against humanity.
Crimes against humanity, that's incredibly serious.
Extremely serious. Amnesty International, for instance, stated the Salvadoran state implemented a systematic policy of torture against detainees. That underscores the fundamental conflict between a purely punitive approach and internationally recognized human rights standards.
Like the UN's Mandela rules.
Exactly. The conditions within CECOT and other Salvadoran prisons seem a clear violation of the Mandela rules, which emphasize individualized treatment, rehabilitation, not just confinement and punishment in degrading conditions.
Let's go back to the issue of children for a second.
Yeah.
Lowering the age of criminal responsibility, transferring teenagers to adult prisons.
Yeah.
That's particularly disturbing.
It is profoundly concerning. The documented cases of torture and abuse against children in Salvador in detention, plus the sheer number held many reportedly without gang links.
Yeah.
That should be a major red flag for any country considering similar policies. Colombia has its own constitutional protections for minors. Emulating El Salvador here could directly undermine those vital safeguards. Fernando Tamayo specifically warned about this.
And the mass arrests, the extended pretrial detention in El Salvador, holding tens of thousands potentially indefinitely without trial, that clearly violates international norms too.
Absolutely. And for Colombia, which, as we discussed, already struggles with a high rate of pretrial detention.
Right, 48%.
Adopting such an approach could have catastrophic consequences. The Colombian Ombudsman's office itself warned it could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe in their prisons. Over 58,000 in pretrial detention in El Salvador, many with no clear time limits. That's a stark violation of the American Convention on Human Rights.
The reports of torture, the high number of deaths in custody in El Salvador, that's especially alarming when you think about the existing violence and instability in Colombia's own prisons.
Precisely. With a track record of riots and internal violence, Colombia faces a significant risk of just making things worse by adopting harsher, less transparent methods.
Those 350-plus deaths in Salvadoran custody, attributed to beatings, neglect. It's a grim warning.
It really is. The Colombian Commission of Jurists has rightly emphasized prioritizing rehabilitation, addressing root causes, rather than just focusing purely on punishment.
And the broader societal impact in El Salvador, stifling civic space, intimidating journalists, human rights defenders. These are threats to democracy itself.
They are indeed, and for Colombia, where freedom of expression already faces challenges.
10 journalists killed in 2024.
Right, according to the Foundation for Press Freedom. Following El Salvador's lead could further erode these essential liberties. There's also that very real danger of replacing gang violence with state-sponsored violence.
Which could echo darker parts of Colombia's own past.
Exactly. Potentially leading to further alienation of marginalized communities, undermining long-term peace efforts. Both the Conversation and Amnesty have cautioned about this.
So as Colombia seriously weighs this path, it's navigating a really complex landscape. Lots of challenges, huge ethical considerations. It's definitely not just a simple policy copy-paste job.
Not at all. The political environment in Colombia is already deeply divided. You've got strong voices pushing for this hardline approach.
Like Milano.
Right. And equally strong voices pushing for comprehensive systemic reforms instead. Minister Milano's specific proposal in March 2025 for that Bogotá mega prison, it immediately triggered significant opposition.
Yeah, the reaction was immediate, forceful. Human rights groups called it a potential disaster for rights and democracy. There were protests, right? No to Bukele's prisons in El Espectador.
Exactly. Yet public opinion surveys show there is also significant support for tougher measures, around 55%, according to that 2024 Invamer poll.
But didn't that same poll show concerns about human rights abuses?
It did. A large majority, 70%, expressed concerns about abuses. So there's definitely a level of skepticism towards the Bukele approach, even among those wanting tougher action. You see it online, too, people expressing mixed feelings. This divided public sentiment creates a really difficult political challenge for President Petro.
He's getting pressure from both sides then. Conservatives like Milano pushing the Bukele model, while progressives in his own coalition, like Senator Pizarro, are warning against sacrificing values for security.
Right. That Senate debate earlier this year really highlighted this deep ideological divide. Pizarro argued crime is a symptom of deeper inequality, not just a problem solved with more violence.
And then there are just the practical logistical hurdles. Building a mega prison like CCOT, that costs serious money.
Huge money. Estimates for CECOT, like the one from the Washington Post, suggest around $200 million.
$200 million. That's a significant strain on Colombia's economy, which is still recovering, isn't it?
It is. GDP growth was only 1.2% in 2024, according to the World Bank. Plus, think about staffing.
Yeah, they're already short on guards.
Exactly. That reported 1.15 guard-to-inmate ratio is way below the international standard of 1.5. Managing a massive new facility would require a huge increase in trained personnel. That's not a quick or easy fix.
How the government engages with different groups seems crucial, too. Those initial meetings with Bukele's team got criticized for lacking transparency.
They did. And human rights groups are rightly demanding meaningful inclusion in any further discussions, citing international obligations.
Petro did commit to consulting, though.
He did. He made a public commitment saying, "We will not act recklessly. Any policy we adopt must respect the dignity of all Colombians." But, the actual implementation of that promise is what will be critical to watch.
Ultimately, it really seems like addressing the underlying root causes poverty, inequality, that high Gini coefficient. That's the more sustainable long-term approach, isn't it?
Many experts argue exactly that. The stalled Total Peace Initiative, the resurgence of groups like Clan del Golfo, they underscore the complexity. Relying solely on a tough prison strategy risks being just a superficial fix.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a deep wound.
Something like that. As Fernanda Tamayo observed, these kinds of hardline projects often haven't shown long-term efficiency. They can end up generating more exclusion, greater social problems down the line.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, the fundamental tension is still right there, isn't it?
It absolutely
The
is.
seemingly attractive prospect of El Salvador's quick drop in crime rates, juxtaposed with the deeply concerning human rights consequences and all the substantial challenges Colombia would face trying to replicate that model in its own very distinct context.
President Petro and his administration face an incredibly delicate balancing act here.
Yeah. How do you address the very legitimate public concerns about safety and security without undermining Colombia's democratic principles or making the already critical prison situation even worse?
It's a truly monumental task. There are no easy answers.
And it's vital to remember, isn't it, that just adopting a tough-on-crime stance might not actually address the core drivers of criminal behavior.
Exactly. Prioritizing comprehensive systemic reforms, investing in prevention education, jobs improving judicial efficiency and fairness,
Yeah.
these might ultimately offer more effective, more sustainable solutions than just relying on repressive measures alone.
This whole complex situation leaves us with a really important question for you, our listeners, to consider. Given all the nuances and potential pitfalls we've explored today, what are the absolute non-negotiable principles that Colombia must uphold as it tries to tackle these intertwined crises of crime and prisons? And thinking beyond the extremes, is there actually a viable third way out there? A path that could more effectively balance the urgent need for security with the fundamental imperative to protect human rights? Something different from Colombia's current struggles and El Salvador's chosen path.
It's a crucial question to ponder, definitely. What does that balance look like in practice?